the pervasive, medicinal odor of harsh chlorhexidine scrubbing solution mixed with the faint, underlying ozone from the continuous sealing air purification system dominated the heavy, unmoving atmosphere of Recovery Suite 9. Outside the double-paned reinforced window glass, the late summer twilight of Oregon faded into a cold, damp dusk. It threw long, distorted gray geometry across the array of digital telemetry monitors mounted along the wall. The glowing time counter above the primary diagnostic equipment indicated precisely 7:50 in the evening of a humid summer day in the year 2026. I forced my left eye open, combating the profound neurological pressure that continued to radiate from the base of my skull. This was a residual metric of the mild cerebral concussion I had sustained when the iron support beams collapsed at the shipping terminal. The main patient display unit maintained a low, rhythmic frequency, capturing the uneven cardiovascular baseline of a physical structure that had narrowly escaped the total weight of a fractured loading platform. The violent impact at the harbor works had completely disrupted my equilibrium. It left me with 2 displaced right ribs that produced a sharp, white-hot flash of agony across my ribcage with every mechanical extension of my diaphragm. Every breath functioned as a precise, expensive expenditure of limited physical force. It was an internal taxation that demanded direct, deliberate management. I extended my left fingers with absolute slowness across the cold metal frame of the safety rail. I carefully suppressed the auxiliary muscles of my shoulder to prevent a sudden wave of somatic trauma from invading my chest wall. My fingertips crept incrementally toward the laminated utility tray where my handheld diagnostic device was resting. My gaze remained completely steady on the battery level indicator as I prepared to access the secure administrative interface. I shifted my physical alignment by a mere fraction of an inch, recording the exact neural feedback delay as the constant intravenous analgesic infusion attempted to neutralize the mounting physical pain. My analytical capabilities remained entirely separate from the internal physical damage, immediately activating the structured, objective logic that had defined my executive standing as a senior specialist in forensic acoustic engineering. At 28 years of age, my recent marriage into the prominent Garrison family had not introduced domestic security. Instead, it established a highly volatile corporate landscape where my role as a stepmother to young Leo Garrison was constantly monitored by my husband, Brooks Garrison, and his older brother, Dorian Garrison. The short-term memory of the harbor installation failure and the subsequent behavioral patterns of my new domestic partners were instantly cataloged within my intellectual system as high-liability variables. As a researcher trained to isolate clean audio signals from overwhelming background noise, I evaluated my current domestic crisis through the metrics of defensive asset protection, rather than the irrational lens of personal panic. I knew with mathematical certainty that an unexpected medical emergency would never alter the fundamental operational profiles of controlling personalities. It merely exposed their absolute lack of functional empathy. The family shipbuilding enterprise and its media subsidiary operated as extractive systems within my financial perimeter. They continuously pulled small digital streams from my independent revenue accounts while providing zero operational equilibrium in return. The calculation was clear and completely devoid of ambiguity. My thumb remained poised above the encrypted data field, initializing a preliminary diagnostic scan on my personal financial log, with the clinical objectivity of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger entry, entirely dismissing the emotional static of the relationship. The technical interface cleared after 3 validation sequences, confirming that a series of unauthorized automated clearinghouse extractions had successfully bypassed my personal account restrictions during my period of physical incapacitation. I adjusted the device angle to minimize the reflection of the amber bedside lamp. My eyes tracked the vertical lines of data as Brooks Garrison stepped into the room. His physical movements carried the rigid, entitled posture of a man accustomed to unquestioned domestic authority. I addressed the core irregularity immediately, without introducing introductory conversation. My voice was flat and calibrated to a low frequency to minimize the expansion of my thoracic injury. Brooks, my personal account registry shows a continuous sequence of automated digital withdrawals that have cleared the external banking gateway without my cryptographic authorization, I stated, keeping my eyes fixed on his facial muscles. My narcissistic husband adjusted the collar of his tailored jacket, his features instantly transitioning into a familiar, dismissive smirk. He typically utilized this look to minimize my professional standing at the National Oceanographic Institute. You are allowing the neurological disorientation of your minor concussion to distort your processing, Kaitlyn, Brooks replied. His tone was saturated with a calculated superiority that echoed against the non-porous wall panels. Your work with historical audio restoration and subsurface wave analysis has clearly made you hypersensitive to routine corporate microtransactions. Dorian authorized those temporary asset relocations through the joint portal to cover essential equipment certifications for Garrison Media while you were unavailable. Discussing these minor administrative adjustments while I am preparing for the executive summit in Seattle represents an unnecessary drain on my schedule. The conversation terminated abruptly as Brooks turned toward the exit corridor. His heavy steps faded into the ambient murmur of the hospital wing without a single inquiry regarding my medical prognosis. The heavy door had barely settled into its frame when young Leo Garrison emerged from the shadows of the secondary visitor alcove. His small, 12-year-old frame moved with a quiet, defensive caution that revealed his long-term survival strategy within the Garrison residence. The boy did not speak. Instead, he extended a worn, insulated digital storage drive, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the component into my left hand. My mother recorded this before the terminal phase of her illness, Leo whispered, his eyes scanning the corridor interface outside the glass partition. Brooks and Dorian have been running the sound systems at the media office every night, changing the master files. They told me the legacy trust accounts were completely empty. I inserted the drive into the auxiliary port of my engineering unit, initializing the Audio Forensic Suite 8.2 to bypass the corruption layers on the track. The audio file was heavily masked by a dense blanket of artificial white noise. As I deployed the primary reflective spectral deconvolution filters, the unmistakable voice of the late Clara Garrison emerged from the static. She detailed the explicit legal isolation of her son's inheritance framework. The capital was strictly off-limits to the media company accounts. An absolute operational clarity settled over my consciousness, completely neutralizing the remaining physiological shock of the workplace accident as I finalized the forensic verification of the data logs. I executed a deep system audit on the joint banking framework, discovering that a precise sum of $7,850 had been systematically extracted from my personal accounts every 7 days. The internal verification script confirmed that this exact transaction pattern had completed 23 consecutive cycles. This accumulated a total financial deficit of $180,550 within a 14-month window. The metadata tags on the electronic authorization forms revealed that every single request had been submitted through the administrative server block registered to Dorian Garrison's private media platform. It was disguised under the fraudulent title of phantom intellectual property licensing fees. They had weaponized the structural loopholes of the shared account directory to extract my personal capital. They used my independent research revenue to absorb the operational debts of their failing corporate entities, while believing my physical recovery would prevent an active intervention. I locked the comprehensive forensic report into an unalterable digital repository, applying a high-tier cryptographic seal over the file path before routing the absolute proof straight to the secure database of the federal prosecutor's office. The diagnostic monitors returned to a steady, silent tracking state, the green progression bars clearing from the console as the space stabilized into an absolute, cold quiet. The profound mechanical silence of the Medical Center South Pavilion stabilized completely as the last operational shifts of the nursing staff departed the immediate corridor grid. The digital telemetry readout, positioned directly above the orthopedic frame, indicated exactly 11 o'clock at night. Its continuous, low-frequency electrical hum served as the solitary acoustic anchor inside the darkness of Recovery Room 9. The sharp, yellow illumination projecting from the single adjustable bedside wall panel cut across the sterile environment in fixed, narrow geometric shapes. It cast elongated shadows over the cold aluminum surfaces of the diagnostic monitors. Outside the double-paned perimeter security glass, the heavy summer atmosphere of the coastal Pacific Northwest felt entirely motionless, pressing firmly against the massive concrete facade of the Portland Medical Center. The air inside the immediate enclosure was kept dry, heavily cooled, and deeply saturated with the industrial odor of synthetic chemical floor sealant and localized sanitizing agents. I adjusted my upper skeletal alignment within the rigid metallic frame of the clinical bed, maintaining a calculated vertical posture to suppress the immediate muscular protest of my fractured right ribs. My left hand remained perfectly flat against the cold security rail, my fingertips slowly tracing the microscopic imperfections of the brushed steel bar to establish a baseline of physical orientation. Young Leo Garrison remained seated on the low footstool near the base of the medical frame. His small hands carefully balanced a secondary external hard drive that contained the original analog recording blocks of his deceased mother's estate declaration. I extended my left arm with extreme, calculated slow movements, minimizing the engagement of my deep intercostal muscles to avoid a sudden explosion of white-hot neural pain across my thoracic wall as I took the physical storage unit. My cognitive architecture operated with absolute cold separation from the localized physical trauma, immediately processing the newly acquired data streams through the objective metrics of forensic audio verification. As a senior specialist trained in subsurface acoustic analysis, I evaluated the unfolding structural betrayal through the clear variables of risk management, rather than the chaotic lens of familial resentment. The short-term memory of Brooks Garrison's dismissive verbal evasion from earlier that evening was permanently cataloged within my intellectual system as a verified indicator of systemic operational liability. I knew with statistical certainty that an individual displaying severe narcissistic behavioral patterns would view a domestic partner's physical crisis not as a situation requiring empathy. Instead, they saw it as an ideal operational window to execute unauthorized resource extractions. The tactical decision to utilize my personal salary infrastructure as a clear transmission conduit for the systemic exhaustion of Leo's inheritance property was a cold, calculated move. It stripped away any remaining ambiguity regarding the true financial insolvency of the Garrison estate. I did not permit a single unit of mental energy to transition into personal anger or emotional volatility. Instead, my mind functioned with the unyielding performance of a high-speed database processor. I prepared to deploy the primary frequency filters to isolate the clean vocal metrics from the heavily distorted track, ensuring that every hidden variable within the digital signature would be laid bare before the system could implement an alternative diversion strategy. The young boy remained completely still near the edge of the clinical mattress. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and saturated with the chronic survival caution of a child accustomed to absolute domestic surveillance. I connected the localized data terminal to the auxiliary power bus of my forensic engineering suite, watching the vertical columns of the initialization script populate the display screen with rows of dark gray operational indicators. Look closely at the primary frequency distribution on this graph, Leo, I stated, keeping my voice modulated to a low, sustained register to minimize the mechanical expansion of my injured right lung. The dense layer of white noise injected across this specific audio block is not a natural artifact of old magnetic tape degradation. It represents an intentional digital override designed to mask a fundamental shift in the underlying asset allocation parameters. The child leaned his head forward, the pale yellow light from the bedside panel reflecting off his pupils as his fingers tightened against the fabric of his sleeve, demonstrating the somatic response of a listener processing highly volatile information. The late Clara Garrison's original voice track has been subjected to multiple micro-edits within the corporate office of Garrison Media. This meant that Brooks and Dorian spent months running complex noise generators over these specific files to hide the explicit constraints of the trust. They needed to manufacture a ghost compliance record to justify the extraction of $7,850 every single week, relying on the assumption that a 12-year-old beneficiary would never possess the technical tools to query the database or identify the joint account vulnerability. The forensic processing system completed its second deconvolution pass within 4 minutes, exposing the precise mechanics of the financial extraction matrix that Brooks and Dorian had established across our shared banking network. The analytical software traced the weekly flow of $7,850, mapping its linear trajectory as it departed the child's protected estate fund, cleared my personal administrative routing codes, and landed directly inside the primary operating account of Garrison Media. The system verified that this exact automated clearinghouse extraction pattern had successfully completed 23 continuous cycles without a single manual intervention or security alert from the Region A compliance servers. The economic reality was stark. The entire shipbuilding infrastructure and the media company managed by the Garrison brothers were completely hollow commercial shells, holding millions in unhedged commercial debt after expanding their physical facilities too rapidly. Every single dollar stolen from Leo's legacy property had been instantly consumed to dissolve the immediate credit defaults of my husband. Meanwhile, a secondary block of capital was diverted to finance the premium corporate hospitality suite they used during their recent capital acquisition trip to Seattle. By converting these protected estate funds into phantom intellectual property licensing fees, they had executed a deliberate pattern of systemic extortion, moving their domestic actions straight into the jurisdiction of Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1343. An absolute silent finality descended over the interior of the recovery suite as the terminal processing logs completed their synchronization, locking the electronic evidence into an unalterable digital package. I did not manifest the slightest trace of neuromuscular hesitation as I routed the entire forensic portfolio, including the restored voice recordings and the joint account tracking metrics, straight to the federal prosecutor's regional database. The family facade that Brooks and Dorian had attempted to preserve through systematic asset diversion was now legally compromised, and the defensible paper trail in my possession was mathematically absolute. I looked toward the window, where the last remnants of the coastal twilight had completely dissolved into a dark, unmoving night, leaving the glass surface to reflect nothing but the sterile illumination of the medical hardware. The young boy looked up at my expression, his posture slowly losing its rigid defensiveness as he recognized the absolute certainty of the technical containment framework we had just initialized. The room returned to its deep, unyielding stillness, punctuated only by the regular, mechanical clicking of the intravenous line as the final database entries cleared the active monitor grid. The unyielding architectural vibration of the deep server enclosure managed by the National Oceanographic Institute established an absolute physical boundary against the standard atmospheric conditions of the Portland harborfront. The digital interface displays fixed above the primary hardware racks indicated exactly 11 o'clock in the morning of a cold Monday. Their constant green and white data matrices cast a sharp, flickering illumination across the heavy frosted glass partitions. The air within this subterranean technical facility was maintained at an unyielding 54 degrees Fahrenheit to preserve the integrity of the high-density processing clusters, carrying an industrial scent saturated with clean metallic copper, dry silicon boards, and occasional ozone discharges from the massive ventilation blowers. A continuous, heavy roar from the emergency hardware cooling units filled the acoustic perimeter, creating an impenetrable auditory barrier that isolated my focus entirely from the exterior operations of the commercial shipyard. I extended my left arm with deliberate, calculated slow motions, balancing my center of gravity against the cold surface of the terminal desk to minimize the immediate physical protest of my 2 fractured right ribs. Every breath required a conscious authorization of my respiratory system. This was a sharp biological tax that registered as a localized flash of agony along my lower thoracic wall if my posture shifted out of vertical alignment. My fingers moved incrementally across the high-grade matte interface console, my gaze remaining perfectly centered on the primary cryptographic input window as I adjusted the terminal height to protect my recovering skeletal frame from unnecessary muscular strain. Young Leo Garrison stood perfectly motionless immediately to my left. His small frame was partially illuminated by the pale blue glare of the central mainframe as he extended his hand to hold the auxiliary storage drive steady against the terminal input port. My cognitive faculties remained entirely insulated from the residual physiological trauma of the shipping terminal collapse, immediately deploying the objective mathematical models that governed my tenure as a forensic analyst. The short-term memory of the vehicular exclusion and the systematic extraction of $180,550 from my private accounts by my husband was filed within my intellectual ledger as a baseline risk indicator. I did not allocate a single unit of voice capacity or mental energy to personal anger. Instead, my internal processing reverted to the cold diagnosis of an industrial system failure. I evaluated the fraudulent actions of Brooks Garrison and Dorian Garrison through the exact technical metrics I utilized when resolving severe signal corruption within marine navigation logs. The entire marriage structure had been recategorized as a compromised system asset that required immediate administrative containment to secure the material survival of the young boy standing beside me. The presence of the noise-injected estate tape was not an emotional tragedy, but a highly volatile piece of technical evidence that required advanced frequency filtration to override the artificial distortion. I calibrated my internal focus to identify the specific mathematical signatures within the digital record, knowing with absolute certainty that the definitive paper trail we were constructing would permanently dissolve their corporate access, long before they could initialize a secondary defensive diversion. The software interface stabilized immediately upon receiving my unique security clearance codes, displaying the comprehensive parameter fields of the Audio Forensic Suite 8.2 across 3 adjacent monitoring units. I turned my head toward the boy, keeping my respiration shallow and controlled to prevent the fractured bone segments from compressing the surrounding nerve clusters as I initiated the primary voice isolation script. The data files that Dorian registered under the exclusive copyright of Garrison Media are about to undergo a complete spectral deconstruction, Leo, I stated. My voice maintained a low, unyielding frequency that matched the hum of the mainframe. Your father believed that by injecting a dense, non-linear distortion matrix over your mother's original recording, he could permanently delete the ancestral ownership clauses without triggering an institutional audit. We are utilizing the multi-channel dynamic waveform analyzer to isolate the baseline harmonic frequencies of her voice. This effectively separates her original speech metrics from the artificial white noise they superimposed during their late-night edits at the media office. The child leaned closer to the primary display panel, his pupils widening slightly as the vertical frequency bars began to shift from dark crimson to high-intensity blue, demonstrating the physical stillness of a listener witnessing a critical calculation. This system does not rely on subjective interpretation. It tracks the specific metadata changes that occurred when Brooks used his office station to overwrite the structural trust parameters, giving us the exact digital evidence required under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1836. The internal processing algorithms completed the reflective spectral deconvolution pass within 90 seconds, exposing a systematic pattern of digital manipulation that crossed every compliance boundary. The system monitor highlighted 32 distinct micro-edits where Brooks had manually altered the digital audio stream, slicing out the specific phrases that prohibited the liquidation of the estate property and replacing them with an unauthorized authorization clause. The validation report generated a definitive digital metadata verification alert, confirming that the signature files had been modified using the administrative credentials assigned to the shipbuilding design office. As each layered filter stripped away the superimposed static, the clean voice of the deceased mother returned to the center of the acoustic space. She explicitly stated that the protection funds were never to be transferred to the media company registry. The financial logging module calculated that this fraudulent licensing scheme had been utilized to cover precisely 23 separate automated clearinghouse extractions of $7,850, accumulating a massive total loss that moved their collective actions into a high-tier federal wire fraud classification. I directed the engineering console to integrate the restored wave data with the historical transaction histories from the family bank holding company, binding the technical forgery directly to the unauthorized movement of the capital assets. An absolute, unblinking clarity dominated my consciousness as the terminal interface updated to show 100% compilation of the defensible paper trail. I did not waste physical force on a single emotional gesture. Instead, my right index finger executed the final submission command on the encrypted terminal, authorizing the immediate electronic transmission of the comprehensive fraud package to the federal prosecutor's secure database. The complex technical file, containing the isolated vocal tracks, the verified metadata history, and the explicit violations of the Defend Trade Secrets Act, was officially logged into the judicial grid, beyond the reach of any corporate representative. I reached down with absolute slowness to disconnect the external storage hardware. My facial muscles remained completely immobile under the sterile blue light of the mainframe as the system bars cleared from the main control station. The young boy looked at the dark gray monitor screen, his physical posture losing its tension as he recognized the absolute finality of the tracking matrix we had just established against his father's company. The room returned to its deep, freezing stillness, punctuated only by the regular, mechanical roar of the primary server cooling ducts as the outbound data streams completed their transmission cycle, leaving the legal space silent. The heavy architectural insulation of the grand reception hall rejected the external atmospheric turbulence of downtown Portland at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The expansive interior space featured a high ceiling constructed entirely from dark, aged oak timbers, creating a massive acoustic vault that multiplied the low hum of integrated media systems. The air within the chamber carried a distinct scent of premium wood wax, heavy floor polish, and the ozone produced by continuous digital display connectivity. Outside the structural framing, the bright summer sun cast long, geometric beams through the tall, arched glass windows, throwing a brilliant, hot glare directly across the polished wood table where my workstation rested. I sat perfectly centered in the high-backed ergonomic chair, keeping my posture entirely fixed to suppress the localized protest of my fractured right ribs. My left hand remained extended flat against the smooth wood grain, minimizing the muscular engagement of my upper torso, while my eyes monitored the steady movement of corporate representatives entering the facility. The medical compression bands beneath my formal attire created a constant, unyielding restriction with every respiratory cycle, forcing a slow, deliberate cadence in my physical presence. I adjusted my wrist by a mere fraction of an inch to access the digital verification token. My fingers moved with extreme slowness to minimize the physical strain across my thoracic wall. Brooks Garrison and Dorian Garrison stood near the primary stage assembly, their faces illuminated by the direct afternoon sunlight as they reviewed the unified corporate charts. My cognitive processing remained completely separated from the high-pressure environment of the media gala, operating with the cold, analytical detachment that defined my tenure as a forensic analyst. I evaluated the unfolding structural scenario through the metrics of risk mitigation rather than the chaotic lens of personal betrayal. The short-term memory of the unauthorized extractions from my private accounts by my husband was permanently indexed within my intellectual system as a verified liability profile. I knew with statistical certainty that an individual displaying severe narcissistic behavioral patterns would view the integration of family assets as a simple mechanism to absorb private debt. The strategic deployment of the $400,000 cross-collateralization agreement was a calculated trap designed to bind my independent inheritance property to their failing shipbuilding and media enterprise. I did not permit a single unit of mental capacity to transition into emotional volatility. Instead, my mind functioned as a high-speed actuary terminal. I analyzed the structural loopholes they were attempting to exploit, viewing their verbal assertions as mere background noise that required a permanent system override. My focus remained entirely locked on the digital execution window. My respiration was shallow, measured, and completely controlled to ensure my tactical response would clear the network before the official partnership announcement could close. Brooks Garrison approached the private seating alcove with a rigid, aggressive posture, his hand holding an administrative tablet interface as he leaned directly over my recovery frame. The digital document displayed on the screen was titled Cross-Collateralization Asset Guarantee, demanding my biometric verification for a $400,000 operational expansion loan. You will finalize this verification sequence immediately before the international investors initialize the formal signing, Brooks directed, his tone dropping into a low, threatening register that vibrated against the oak paneling. If you refuse to secure this corporate financing line for Garrison Media, I will immediately initiate a formal custody revision through the family court registry, separating you from Leo's permanent custody profile. I maintained my absolute outward neutrality, my facial muscles remaining completely immobile as I adjusted the terminal interface. You are demanding that I attach my family inheritance property to a debt structure that has already violated the basic parameters of fiduciary duty, Brooks, I replied, my voice calibrated to a flat frequency. My narcissistic husband straightened his spine, his mouth twisting into a dismissive smirk as he gestured toward the main stage, where Dorian was initializing the presentation links. Your independent research assets mean nothing compared to the long-term capitalization of this family name. So execute the digital validation now or face immediate legal isolation. I extended my right index finger with calculated slowness toward the biometric scanning surface of the tablet, maintaining a perfectly steady physical contact with the glass interface. I did not execute a standard confirmation signature. Instead, I initialized the secure digital workspace of the Audio Forensic Suite 8.2 through a hidden command script. Before the data packet could clear the external banking gateway, I embedded an advanced cryptographic marker within the electronic document profile, explicitly introducing the invalidity due to fraudulent inducement clause. The hidden mathematical script was programmed to automatically invalidate the signature parameters the exact moment the corporate files were cross-referenced against the federal database, establishing an absolute protection layer. The tablet interface flashed green, indicating a successful transaction clearance to Brooks, who immediately snatched the hardware away without noticing the internal system alteration. He walked rapidly toward the main stage, joining Dorian beneath the large digital display screens that projected the unified financial map of the family assets. The brothers stood together before the assembly of 200 institutional investors, their faces radiant with an unearned entitlement as they announced my complete financial agreement. I stood up from my seat with absolute precision, my spine perfectly straight as I walked directly toward the central technical control podium. An absolute heavy silence descended over the grand reception hall as I bypassed the primary security boundary of the technical console, my fingers instantly accessing the master display controls. The brilliant afternoon sun continued to pour through the tall, arched glass windows, but the internal light of the auditorium was completely overtaken by the sudden transformation of the projection screens. The unified financial chart was wiped from the display network, replaced by the complete, unalterable data columns of the forensic acoustic report and the direct tracing logs of the stolen capital. The 200 institutional investors remained completely frozen in their seats, their eyes tracking the massive crimson error indicators that documented the systemic identity theft and wire fraud violations. Brooks turned his head toward the control podium, his face instantly losing its color as he witnessed the permanent collapse of the commercial illusion he had spent years constructing. The technical architecture of the facility was completely locked under my executive clearance, preventing any manual override by the media staff as the automated compliance alerts cleared the outbound network gateway. The room remained fixed in a profound, motionless stillness, punctuated only by the regular electronic chime of the primary console as the data verified our absolute independence. The heavy acoustic pressure within the grand judicial and conference pavilion intensified significantly as the scheduled afternoon presentation hit its terminal milestone. The digital indicator above the main projection array read exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, its continuous low-frequency hum providing the primary atmospheric tone across the expansive hall. The sharp illumination from the high, arched glass windows cut through the upper structure, throwing long, geometric patterns of pale light directly onto the central control console, where my fingers rested. Outside the reinforced glass perimeter, the coastal wind over the Portland waterfront drove heavy storm clouds across the horizon, creating a moving backdrop of gray shadows against the massive stone pillars. The internal air remained dry, intensely cooled by the commercial climate units, and deeply saturated with the smell of floor wax and corporate electrical hardware. I kept my spine held in an unyielding vertical alignment to isolate the severe physical protest of my 2 recovering right ribs. My left hand maintained a flat, steady pressure against the edge of the control desk, my fingers tracing the cold metal seam of the input panel to anchor my physical movement. Young Leo Garrison stood exactly 2 inches to my left, his small hands holding the backup storage interface with absolute stainless as the system prepared to execute the master command. I extended my right index finger with extreme, calculated slowness across the touchscreen glass, ignoring the sharp flare of discomfort that tracked my thoracic wall with every deep inhalation. The entire auditorium remained suspended in a temporary quiet, the low murmur of 200 institutional investors providing a dense acoustic background as I finalized the cryptographic validation. My intellectual faculties operated with complete, icy detachment from the immediate domestic disruption, processing the unfolding legal crisis through the objective metrics of signal analysis and asset protection. I monitored the physical paralysis of my husband and his brother with the neutral precision of an engineer evaluating a compromised data track on a terminal display. The short-term memory of the fraudulent asset extractions, the altered metadata profiles, and the empty promises of familial support were permanently filed within my cognitive directory as verified liabilities. I did not allocate a single unit of psychological energy to personal anger or the concept of marital betrayal. Instead, my internal thoughts functioned as a high-speed processor, computing the legal trajectory of the forensic documents I had transmitted to the Department of Justice. The entire marital alliance had been officially recategorized as a bankrupt entity. It was a structural threat that required complete, immediate liquidation to preserve the legal rights of the child standing beside me. I knew with mathematical certainty that the transactional momentum Brooks and Dorian had established through systematic extortion had reached its absolute terminal node, and no emotional appeals could alter the execution of the federal compliance scripts. My gaze remained perfectly locked on the primary system activation bar, my breathing shallow and controlled to prevent the fractured bone segments from altering my outward expression of total stability. The technical console responded instantly to my biometric command, the screen flashing with high-intensity blue lines as the system executed the master override script across the facility network. The huge digital display screens above the stage transformed completely, wiping away the fabricated corporate charts and replacing them with the isolated harmonic frequencies of the original estate tape. "Look directly at the data streams, Brooks," I stated, my voice keeping a low, unyielding register that cut through the sudden rise of noise in the auditorium. "The automated spectral deconvolution pass has completely removed your late-night edits, exposing the explicit structural clauses that barred the transfer of the family assets to Garrison Media." Brooks moved toward the podium with a sudden, uncontrolled physical acceleration, his face twisting into an aggressive grimace as his hand reached out to intercept the technical interface. "You have committed a fatal operational error, Kaitlyn," he shouted, his breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps as the investors began checking their personal mobile devices. "You are weaponizing a private family matter to destroy our international financing line during a live capital summit." The chief legal counsel representing the federal task force stepped between us, calmly presenting a certified document block that bore the official seals of the United States District Court, effectively terminating his desperate advance. Under the provisions of Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1343, your corporate accounts are officially closed to external transfers. The heavy double barriers at the rear of the Grand Hall were suddenly thrown open by direct judicial authority. The physical impact echoed sharply against the oak timbers of the ceiling as the law enforcement detachment initiated its containment sequence. Special agents from the Department of Homeland Security and uniformed state marshals advanced into the central aisle, their movements rapid, coordinated, and entirely non-negotiable. The lead officer presented the unsealed emergency criminal arrest warrants, identifying Brooks Garrison and Dorian Garrison as the primary targets of a federal wire fraud and estate exploitation indictment. Brooks attempted to pull his arm away as the first marshal closed the physical distance, but his movements were immediately neutralized, his wrists secured behind his back with the sharp metallic snap of standard steel restraints. Simultaneously, the corporate legal team served the asset freeze order to the regional banking representatives present in the room, immediately paralyzing the entire financial infrastructure of Garrison Media. Every automated clearinghouse interface, every merchant processing directory, and every active checking repository registered to their corporate identification numbers transitioned to a restricted state within 3 seconds. Helena Garrison collapsed onto the edge of the conference table, her tears spilling over the laminated printouts of the fraudulent records as she begged me to withdraw the evidence to protect the family name. An absolute, unblinking clarity dominated the vast space as the federal transport team cleared the remaining corporate representatives from the central stage, leaving the room in a state of sudden structural liquidation. I did not move a single muscle in response to the emotional pleas of my mother-in-law, nor did I allow the frantic verbal outbursts of my husband to alter the neutral metrics of my expression. The technical integration was complete. The total loss of $180,550 was permanently documented, and the defensible paper trail was now under active federal surveillance. The international investors pulled their capital allocations out within minutes, activating their emergency exit clauses to avoid association with a major healthcare and wire fraud prosecution. I reached down with absolute slowness to disconnect my cryptographic security token, my fingers steady as the large digital screens behind the podium returned to a neutral, dark gray monitoring state. The young boy looked up at my face, his small hand relaxing completely within mine as he realized the controlling system that had governed his life was permanently broken. The grand hall stabilized into a profound, motionless quiet, punctuated only by the regular hum of the main server stacks as the external enforcement vehicles departed the complex. The natural sequence of seasonal transition enforced its own structural equilibrium across the Pacific Northwest coastline at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The vast architectural expansion of the nonprofit audio facility, established under the permanent designation of Margaret House, offered a clean, unobstructed view of the peaceful Portland harbor. The rich autumn light cut through the high, reinforced glass windows of the central monitoring room, throwing long, precise geometric angles of deep amber across the polished granite floor. The internal atmosphere was perfectly regulated, completely free from the heavy coastal moisture that dominated the external maritime environment, smelling faintly of clean mineral stone, wood finish, and filtered air currents. I proceeded with a measured, highly deliberate gait along the open technical corridor, my left arm swinging smoothly, completely free of the restrictive medical wraps that had once bound my thoracic structure following the shipyard accident. My right hand extended downward with absolute fluid stability, my fingers resting loosely against the soft tweed jacket of my stepson, Leo Garrison, who was navigating the wide granite walkway with the steady, unhurried steps of an independent youth. His solid leather shoes made a soft, rhythmic patter against the stone, his quiet verbal confirmations echoing gently toward the acoustic wood panels above our heads. The ambient soundscape was defined by the low, controlled murmur of automated digital tape drives and distant harbor wind, providing a neutral background that supported my sensory realignment after months of intense judicial litigation. Exactly 12 months had elapsed since the federal district court finalized the criminal indictment against the former executive directors of the Garrison enterprise, allowing my cognitive processing to evaluate the completed timeline with absolute analytical detachment. The short-term memory of the medical recovery suite, the aggressive corporate threats delivered during the media gala, and the subsequent systemic liquidations remained cataloged within my intellectual directory as closed system variables. My emotional architecture had been entirely insulated from the domestic friction, leaving my logical faculties completely free to monitor the extensive asset relocation protocols required to permanently stabilize our new independent reality. There were no residual regrets, no internal debates regarding misplaced familial loyalty, and no remaining structural vulnerabilities within my long-term operational strategy. I viewed the complete legal destruction of my former marital alliance not as a personal grievance, but as a routine optimization of capital assets, a necessary purge of high-liability entities that had actively threatened the material survival of my descendant. The parameters of my daily existence had returned to a state of absolute mathematical stability, allowing my focus to remain centered on the secure administrative steps required to distribute our independent resources. My respiration remained slow, deep, and perfectly calm as the golden sunset illuminated the expansive interior workspace of the central hall, reinforcing the permanent structural transition away from the deceptive static of the past. The federal district court had long completed its final evaluation of the technical fraud case file, issuing an absolute judicial decree that permanently locked the penal parameters of the target entities. Dorian Garrison had received a mandatory sentence of 18 years within a secure federal penitentiary under the anti-fraud provisions of the United States Code, while Brooks Garrison was allocated 8 years of institutional confinement without any possibility of administrative bail. During this operational cycle, my primary legal focus had been directed toward completing the absolute divorce decree, an unyielding asset protection shield that permanently separated my personal holdings from the Garrison corporate liabilities. The family debt structures, the pending civil judgments against Garrison Media, and the toxic commercial obligations of the shipyard were completely isolated, ensuring that Leo would never be exposed to their commercial failures. The legal enforcement team had successfully executed the complete asset relocation protocol, extracting the entirety of Leo's protected estate funds from the compromised banking clearinghouses and placing them under my exclusive fiduciary management. This complex restructuring operated as an absolute shield for the child's minority interest, demonstrating that the systematic integration of forensic data and estate law could permanently neutralize the exploitative maneuvers of controlling personalities, forcing the entire legacy system to conform to the precise definitions of statutory compliance. I extracted my tactical engineering interface from its secure internal docking sleeve, initializing the primary cryptographic authentication sequence with a brief touch of my left thumb against the optical sensor array. The system instantly validated my administrative credentials, opening the secure fiduciary workspace that managed our primary asset relocation protocols without displaying a single operational delay. A system notification flashed across the primary display window, confirming that the current allocation cycle had cleared the federal clearinghouse network and populated the main capital repository. For 14 months, this exact amount of $7,850 had been systematically intercepted by a manufactured corporate licensing scheme, redirected to sustain the private debt structures of individuals who viewed my professional competence as a target for exploitation. Now the transaction queue belonged entirely to my command structure, operating under my exclusive authorization within the independent digital network. I accessed the automated distribution algorithm, preparing to divide the incoming capital into 3 separate long-term trust instruments that I had personally established under federal asset placement guidelines to guarantee the permanent material insulation of my stepson's future development, ensuring the systematic integration of our financial resources. With 3 precise mechanical interactions on the touchscreen, I executed the wealth relocation protocol, directing the system to divide the $7,850 into the individual trust balances. The first segment cleared directly into the primary healthcare trust, establishing an absolute protection layer against future medical liabilities, while the second portion was routed into the emergency liquidity reserve to maintain a continuous cash buffer. The final segment was transferred into the long-term future foundation to fund his advanced academic and professional training matrix, the digital interface updating instantly to display a steady green confirmation sequence that verified the absolute finality of the data migration before the network interface returned to a locked state. I slowly removed the heavy forensic monitoring headphones from my neck, placing them down on the console surface with a deliberate, smooth movement of my hand, and pressed the master control switch to archive the entire case history into the root server block permanently. I turned to look out through the massive glass archway, watching the harbor water absorb the deep amber of the late afternoon sky as the wind rippled across the open channels, knowing the system I had engineered for Leo was complete, operationally sound, and completely invulnerable to external disruption. The authentic frequencies of truth have finally overridden the artificial static.